The land is open now. 42 miles of hiking trails cross it. The federal government designated it a national wildlife refuge in 2004. Interpretive signs describe nesting raptors and tallgrass prairie restoration. Families walk the gravel paths on weekend mornings. The administrative reclassification is precise in its mechanics. A wildlife refuge operates under a contamination threshold calibrated for non-residential land use, meaning the acceptable plutonium concentration in surface soil is measured against the activity profile of a burrowing mammal, rather than a crawling human infant. The numerical gap between those two thresholds is not incidental. It is the difference between a $7 billion cleanup bill and a cleanup bill that would exceed the gross domestic product of most sovereign nations. The land was reclassified. The isotopes were not. Rocky Flats sits 15 miles northwest of Denver, Colorado. The plant's core industrial footprint occupied approximately 650 acres within an outer buffer zone of 8,300 total acres. The population center of metropolitan Denver, by the time the plant reached peak operational output in the 1970s, held approximately 1.5 million people in the downwind corridor. The Front Range topography channels atmospheric flow with mechanical regularity. Prevailing winds descend from the Rocky Mountain foothills toward the plains in a well-documented meteorological pattern. The plant's operational engineers understood these wind vectors. They understood them in the context of discharge protocol. The soil beneath the refuge perimeter today registers plutonium-239 concentrations that in any residential zoning classification would require mandatory evacuation and long-term remediation. The administrative reclassification changed the legal threshold. It did not alter the atomic weight of the deposited material. On June 6, 1989, the United States federal government raided itself. 70 armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Environmental Protection Agency breached the perimeter of a Department of Energy facility. The search warrant was sealed. The operational briefing given to plant security characterized the incoming agents as participants in an environmental inspection under a pretext that obscured the legal authority of the warrants they carried. The raid was the culmination of a multi-year investigation run jointly by the FBI's Denver Field Office and the EPA's Criminal Enforcement Division. The investigation had a code name, Operation Desert Glow Dua. The target was a nuclear weapons manufacturing facility that had been operating in systematic violation of federal environmental law for a period investigators would later calculate at more than a decade. The facility's parent contractor was Rockwell International. The facility's owner, in the legal sense that matters, was the American taxpayer, through the Department of Energy. The government raided itself and found what its own classified internal audits had documented and suppressed for years. The inventory discrepancy alone, plutonium and associated radioactive materials, unaccounted for in official ledgers, exceeded 2,600 pounds. The plant's primary industrial function was the manufacture of plutonium pits. A plutonium pit is the fissile core of a thermonuclear weapon. It is a machined sphere of plutonium metal, precisely dimensioned, that serves as the compression target for the implosion assembly in a nuclear warhead. The Rocky Flats facility, operating under the authority of the Atomic Energy Commission and later the Department of Energy, was the sole American manufacturer of these components throughout the Cold War period. At peak production in the 1960s and 70s, the plant produced approximately 1,000 pits per year. Each pit required the machining, casting, and finishing of weapons-grade plutonium-239. The machining process generated metal chips, cutting fluid contaminated with dissolved plutonium, and fine metallic dust. Every gram of that material was by legal mandate subject to precise inventory control under the Atomic Energy Act. The inventory control records maintained at Rocky Flats do not reflect the physical reality of what that machining process dispersed. Plutonium 239 is pyrophoric. The term is precise. Pyrophoric materials ignite spontaneously upon contact with atmospheric oxygen at or below room temperature. Plutonium metal in bulk form is relatively stable, but plutonium in fine particulate form, the turnings, the grinding dust, the residue slurries produced by the machining process, will combust without ignition source under standard atmospheric conditions. The half-life of plutonium-239 is 24,100 years. The geological frame of reference required to understand that number exceeds the entire documented history of human civilization by a factor of approximately 5 dead-old. The element will be biologically active in terms of its decay emission profile, long after the institutional structures created to monitor it have ceased to exist. A single microgram, 1/1,000,000th of a gram, inhaled into pulmonary tissue represents a fixed biological constant. Alpha particles emitted during radioactive decay interact with the surrounding cellular material at close range. The actuarial latency for the resulting cellular depletion cascade is measured in years to decades. The dose is not reversible. The mechanism does not require a threshold. 1 microgram is sufficient to establish the condition. The Rocky Flats plant processed this material in industrial quantities in buildings designed in the early 1950s under safety protocols that were, by subsequent engineering standards, structurally inadequate from the date of first operation. Building 771 was the primary plutonium processing structure at Rocky Flats. Its construction was authorized in 1952. The building housed the machining operations, the casting furnaces, the chemical recovery systems, and the ventilation infrastructure through which all plutonium-laden exhaust air was processed before discharge. The ventilation system relied on high-efficiency particulate air filters, HEPA filters, to capture radioactive particulates before the exhaust stream reached the external atmosphere. The filters were the last line of mechanical containment in the exhaust pathway. The building's plexiglass glove boxes allowed workers to manipulate plutonium metal without direct contact, the heavy rubber gloves fixed into ports in the sealed transparent enclosures. The entire system was engineered with the assumption that the filters would hold, that the glove boxes would not rupture, and that the ventilation ducting would not fail. On September 11, 1957, all 3 assumptions were invalidated simultaneously. The fire in Building 771 began in a storage drum containing plutonium-contaminated cutting oil. The cutting oil was a residue from the machining process, saturated with dissolved and suspended plutonium particles. The ignition mechanism was spontaneous. The pyrophoric fine particulate in the oil drum reached combustion threshold without external heat source. The fire propagated through the machining area and reached the glove boxes. The plexiglass panels of the glove boxes ignited. The fire extended into the ventilation ducting. The HEPA filters, designed to capture particulate in an airflow stream, were not designed to withstand thermal loading from direct flame contact. They failed. The exhaust stacks above Building 771, no longer equipped with functional filtration, became direct discharge points for radioactive combustion products into the external atmosphere. The fire burned for 13 hours before it was controlled. The Atomic Energy Commission's public statement characterized the event as producing a slight risk of light contamination in the immediate facility perimeter. The word slight is an administrative classification. The quantitative data that emerged over subsequent decades of soil sampling tells a different administrative story. The low-end estimate of plutonium dispersed into the atmosphere during the September 11, 1957 fire was 160 grams. The high-end estimate derived from soil core sampling conducted in the 1980s and 90s was 510 grams. The distinction between those two numbers is not trivial. 510 grams of plutonium-239, dispersed as combustion aerosol into a metropolitan wind corridor, represents a contamination event of a magnitude that the Atomic Energy Commission chose, through its public statement, to characterize as slight. The soil record, the physical-chemical record that cannot be revised by administrative language, absorbed both the material and the institutional decision not to quantify it publicly. The 1957 fire was not the only uncontrolled release at Rocky Flats. In 1969, a second major fire occurred in the same building complex, resulting in additional atmospheric dispersal. Between the two events, and in the cumulative product of routine operational discharge over 4 decades, the soil and sediment profiles surrounding the facility accumulated a plutonium signature that later soil sampling campaigns would map with precision. The Superfund-era sampling data showed elevated plutonium concentrations in soil extending to the east and southeast of the plant, following the prevailing wind vectors with the fidelity of a meteorological model. The contamination plume was not random. It was directional. It followed the physics of the front-range atmospheric flow with mechanical regularity, depositing the plant's operational history into the soil of the Denver metropolitan exurban fringe, with a precision that no administrative statement could subsequently revise. The illegal incineration protocol at Rocky Flats was not an accident of negligence. It was a systematic operational procedure with defined meteorological parameters. The facility generated large volumes of plutonium-contaminated waste material that could not be legally disposed of under existing federal regulations. The regulatory framework for transuranic waste disposal in the 1970s and 80s was incomplete. Permanent repository capacity did not exist. The material accumulated. The contractor's solution to the accumulation problem was incineration. The federal regulations governing air discharge from nuclear facilities established maximum permissible concentration limits for radioactive particulate in the external atmosphere. The incineration solution to the accumulation problem was designed to operate within those limits, not by reducing the quantity of material discharged, but by exploiting the dilution mathematics of high-velocity atmospheric dispersal. The front-range Chinook winds are a well-characterized meteorological phenomenon. When high-pressure systems descend from the continental divide, wind velocities at the Rocky Flats site can exceed 40 to 60 miles per hour. At those velocities, the atmospheric mixing volume in the immediate facility vicinity is substantially increased. A fixed quantity of discharged particulate, distributed through a larger mixing volume, produces a lower measured ground-level concentration at the monitoring stations downwind. The plant's operational personnel monitored wind velocity and direction data. Documentation recovered during Operation Desert Glow indicated that waste incineration operations at the facility were preferentially scheduled during high-velocity wind events. The incinerators were activated when the Chinook conditions were optimal for dilution. The smoke plumes from the illegal incinerators rose into the high-velocity wind stream and dispersed across the metropolitan area before the ground-level monitoring stations could log a density spike sufficient to trigger a regulatory reporting requirement. The material did not disappear. It was mechanically diluted across a larger surface area of human habitation. The ledger showed clean numbers. The soil absorbed the remainder. Operation Desert Glow was initiated following years of frustration by EPA enforcement personnel, who had attempted to compel Department of Energy compliance with environmental regulations through administrative channels. The DOE had, throughout the 1980s, resisted EPA inspection authority by invoking national security exemptions. The legal position of the DOE was that its facilities were not subject to state or federal environmental regulatory oversight because the national security mission of those facilities created a jurisdictional supersession. The courts had not clearly resolved the question. The FBI and EPA investigators chose not to wait for the resolution. They assembled their evidence package, informant testimony from plant workers, air monitoring data, soil sampling results, documentary evidence of the illegal incineration scheduling protocol, and obtained a sealed federal search warrant. The warrant authorized the search of a Department of Energy facility. The department of the executive branch that owned the facility was not notified in advance. The agents who breached the Rocky Flats perimeter on June 6, 1989, encountered a facility in active operation. The initial security response attempted to invoke DOE national security protocols to deny entry. The federal search warrant superseded those protocols. The agents entered the facility and began the systematic documentation of conditions in Building 771 and the associated waste storage and processing areas. What they found exceeded their operational briefings. The legal evidentiary threshold they had documented in preparation for the warrant was the floor, not the ceiling, of the violations present at the facility. Room 141 in Building 771 was designated the Infinity Room by the cleanup crews, who subsequently worked in the complex. The designation was not metaphorical. It was a direct reference to the instrument response that the room produced in standard radiation monitoring equipment. The ambient radiation field in Room 141 exceeded the maximum measurable range of the Geiger-Müller survey instruments carried by the initial assessment crews. When a radiation survey meter reaches the upper end of its measurement scale and the radiation field continues to exceed that scale, the instrument displays a maximum scale deflection. In the context of radiation monitoring protocol, a maximum scale reading is colloquially referred to as an infinite reading, indicating that the instrument cannot quantify the field it is measuring. Room 141 produced this response consistently. The room contained accumulated plutonium-contaminated material, process residues, and structural contamination embedded in the walls, floors, and ventilation infrastructure at concentrations that rendered standard survey instruments non-functional as quantitative tools. The room had to be assessed using specialized high-range instruments designed for emergency response in major reactor accident scenarios. The instruments in question were not routinely carried by environmental inspection teams. They had to be procured specifically for the Rocky Flats assessment. The physical extent of contamination within Building 771 was not confined to Room 141. The FBI and EPA documentation of the June 6th raid established that contamination was present throughout the building's primary processing areas, in the ventilation duct systems, in the structural materials of the walls and floors, the concrete itself having absorbed process fluids over decades of operation, and in the soil beneath the building's foundation. The contamination profile was three-dimensional and had been accumulating since the building's first operational year. Cleanup crews working on the facility in subsequent years would require specialized containment protocols, remote handling equipment, and personal protective systems equivalent to those used in post-accident nuclear reactor decommissioning. The building was not a contaminated industrial facility in the sense that a standard hazardous waste site is contaminated. It was a source-term distribution matrix that had been actively distributing its contents into the surrounding environment for approximately 32 years at the time of the raid. The inventory discrepancy at Rocky Flats, the gap between the quantity of fissile and radioactive material that entered the facility on the input side of the ledger and the quantity accounted for on the output side, was documented with increasing precision as the post-raid investigation proceeded. The official figure of 2,600 pounds of unaccounted plutonium and other radioactive materials represents the consolidated inventory reconciliation from 4 decades of operation. It should be noted that the phrase unaccounted for does not mean the material vanished from physical reality. Plutonium-239 does not vanish. Its decay rate is so slow that the inventory loss cannot be attributed to radioactive decay over the facility's operational lifespan. The material went somewhere. The soil contamination record, the Pondcrete failure analysis, the atmospheric dispersal data from the fire events and the illegal incineration program, the groundwater contamination profile documented in the Superfund-era sampling campaigns, These are the distributed physical addresses of the missing inventory. The ledger did not account for them. The environment did. The Pondcrete system at Rocky Flats was an engineering solution to a waste management problem that was itself a product of earlier engineering failures. The facility's plutonium processing operations generated large volumes of liquid radioactive waste that was initially stored in solar evaporation ponds, shallow-lined basins where water was allowed to evaporate, concentrating the radioactive contaminants in the remaining sludge. The ponds accumulated this sludge over years of operation. By the 1980s, the pond system represented a substantial inventory of high-level radioactive waste in liquid and semi-liquid form. The regulatory pressure to empty the ponds and convert their contents to a more stable solid form resulted in the Pondcrete program. The contractor responsible for the Pondcrete operations, EG&G, operating under DOE contract, implemented a process of mixing the radioactive sludge with Portland cement, casting the mixture into 1-ton blocks, and storing the blocks on outdoor asphalt pads, pending eventual disposition to a permanent repository. The technical failure of the Pondcrete blocks was a function of materials science and cost optimization. Portland cement requires a specific water-to-cement ratio to achieve adequate hydration and setting. The radioactive sludge being incorporated into the mixture had a liquid content that varied from batch to batch, and the process controls for maintaining the correct mixture ratio were inadequate. Additionally, the contractor's implementation of the process used substandard cement proportions. The resulting blocks did not achieve the minimum compressive strength required for structural stability. When the blocks were placed on the outdoor asphalt storage pads and subjected to the thermal cycling of seasonal temperature variation and direct solar loading, the material that had failed to achieve complete cementite hydration began to degrade. The chemical bonds that should have locked the radioactive contaminants in a stable solid matrix were insufficient. Under solar thermal loading, the blocks did not merely crack. They flowed. The material returned to a viscous paste consistency, spreading across the asphalt pad surface. The degraded Pondcrete material was exposed to the surface environment. Wind events mobilized the dried surface crust of the failed blocks as airborne particulate. Rain events dissolved soluble components of the mixture and carried them in runoff toward Walnut Creek, a drainage that runs through the facility buffer zone and continues into the larger watershed. Soil contamination profiles around the Pondcrete storage areas showed heavy metal and radionuclide signatures consistent with both wind mobilization and liquid percolation pathways. The volume of material involved in the Pondcrete failure was substantial. Documentation from the cleanup period indicated that hundreds of the 1-ton blocks had experienced significant structural degradation. The mechanical containment of the most concentrated radioactive waste stream at the facility, the solar pond sludge that represented decades of accumulated process residue, had failed on its storage pads, in the open air, in the presence of wind and precipitation, for years before the failure was formally documented and remediation was initiated. The $7 billion cleanup of Rocky Flats was completed by official declaration in 2005. The declaration requires careful parsing. The cleanup was completed in the sense that the above-ground industrial structures were demolished. The most heavily contaminated soils in the core 650-acre industrial zone were excavated and transported to the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico, and the site was graded and revegetated. The cleanup was not completed in the sense that all contamination was removed. It was completed in the sense that the remediation achieved the standard required by the regulatory agreement governing the cleanup, a standard calibrated, as noted at the outset, for wildlife refuge land use rather than residential land use. The difference is numerically significant. The soil concentration of plutonium permitted to remain in place under the wildlife refuge standard is approximately 50 picocuries per gram. The residential standard would have required remediation to approximately 3 picocuries per gram. The clamp ended when the soil reached 50. The material remaining in the soil between 50 and 3 picocuries per gram was classified, through the administrative reclassification of the land use category, from contaminant requiring remediation to acceptable background condition. The core industrial zone, the former footprint of Buildings 771 and the associated processing complex, was not remediated to any standard that would permit unrestricted human access. It remains a sealed subsurface zone, covered with engineered cap material, monitored by a network of groundwater sampling wells. The wells sample for tritium, nitrates, volatile organic compounds, and transuranic radionuclides at regular intervals. The data from these wells is published in annual reports. The data shows that groundwater contamination plumes from the former facility are migrating in the direction of the topographic gradient. The migration rate is slow relative to human time scales. It is not slow relative to the half-life of the material driving the contamination. The institutional framework established to monitor rocky flats in perpetuity is the product of a specific administrative negotiation. The Department of Energy retained the core industrial zone. The surrounding buffer area became the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge, managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The monitoring obligations are distributed between these entities and between state and federal regulatory agencies. The groundwater monitoring program is funded through the DOE's long-term stewardship budget. The budget is subject to annual congressional appropriation. The institutional continuity of the monitoring program is not guaranteed beyond the annual appropriation cycle. The technical premise of long-term stewardship, that institutions created in the 21st century will maintain functional monitoring operations for thousands of years, is not a scientific hypothesis. It is an administrative aspiration recorded in regulatory documents as though it were a plan. The half-life of plutonium-239 is 24,100 years. The entire span of recorded human history is approximately 5,000 years. The institutional frameworks of the modern administrative state, nation-states, regulatory agencies, federal budget cycles, have demonstrated operational continuity over periods measured in decades to centuries. The gap between the required monitoring duration and the demonstrated longevity of the institutional structures assigned to perform that monitoring is not a gap in the conventional sense. It is a structural impossibility acknowledged within the regulatory documents through language about adaptive management and stakeholder engagement that substitutes administrative vocabulary for the mathematical reality of the situation. The isotope does not respond to stakeholder engagement. It follows its decay schedule without reference to the institutional arrangements of the species that manufactured and dispersed it. The hikers on the Rocky Flats Trail system walk over ground that contains plutonium-239 in concentrations that were calibrated against the activity budget of a burrowing mammal and declared acceptable. They walk in the knowledge, if they have sought it, that the land beneath the gravel path has a contamination history documented in thousands of pages of regulatory filings, scientific publications, legal proceedings, and congressional testimony. More often they walk without that knowledge, because the interpretive signage at the trailhead describes nesting raptors and prairie restoration. The contamination history is available in the administrative record. The administrative record is not on the sign. The soil core samples taken at regular depth intervals around the Rocky Flats perimeter during the Superfund characterization campaigns produced a stratigraphic record of the plant's operational history with the fidelity of a geological log. The 1957 fire appears in the soil profile as a discrete elevated concentration layer at the depth corresponding to that year's deposition. The 1969 fire appears as a second layer. The decades of routine operational discharge appear as a diffuse background elevation throughout the profile. The Pondcrete failure appears as a lateral contamination signature in the drainage corridor. The illegal incineration program appears as a broad, low-level elevation across the downwind soil surface, extending to the southeast. The soil is a physical archive of institutional decisions. Unlike the documentary record, which can be classified, amended, or lost through institutional failure, the soil archive cannot be revised. It was written in the physics of alpha decay, and it will remain legible for a period that dwarfs every human institution that has ever existed. The legal resolution of Operation Desert Glow was, by the standard of the documented violations, administratively attenuated. Rockwell International, the prime contractor, pleaded guilty in 1992 to 10 counts of violating federal environmental law.eu. The criminal fine was $18.5 million. The civil settlement that accompanied the plea brought the total financial resolution to approximately $308 million. In the context of a cleanup that would ultimately cost $7 billion, the contractor's financial liability was a fraction of the remediation bill that the federal government, and by extension the public, absorbed. The plea agreement did not require admission of the full scope of violations documented in the FBI and EPA evidence package. Several of the most serious charges related to the illegal incineration protocol and the deliberate scheduling of waste burns during high wind events were resolved through the plea structure in a manner that did not produce trial-level public disclosure of the evidentiary basis. The full documentary record of what was known, when and by whom, remains distributed across sealed legal files, classified DOE internal audits, and partially declassified FBI investigative files. The actuarial framework for understanding the public health consequence of Rocky Flats is constrained by the same institutional decisions that limited the public disclosure of the operational violations. Epidemiological studies of the population in the downwind corridor have produced contested results. The studies show elevated incidence rates of certain malignancies in communities downwind of the facility relative to comparison populations. The methodological disputes around those studies, concerning appropriate comparison populations, latency period assumptions, exposure pathway modeling, and statistical power, have been sufficient to prevent regulatory consensus on causation. The absence of regulatory consensus on causation is itself an administrative outcome. The studies exist. The elevated incidence rates in the data are documented. The translation of those documented rates into regulatory finding of causal relationship requires an institutional process that has not produced that finding. The soil and the biology record the same history. The administrative record has not confirmed the translation between them. The groundwater beneath the Rocky Flats site flows toward the south and southeast, following the topographic gradient toward the metropolitan Denver water supply watershed. The monitoring well network established under the long-term stewardship program tracks the migration of the contamination plume through the subsurface. The annual monitoring reports document the plume's position, its chemical signature, and its rate of migration. The reports use language calibrated to regulatory compliance, concentrations below maximum contaminant levels, trends within expected parameters, no exceedances requiring remedial response. The language is accurate in its reference to the regulatory standards. The regulatory standards were established in the context of specific pathway assumptions. Exposure scenarios based on the land use classification that followed the administrative reclassification. If the land use classification changes, if the buffer zone is ever rezoned for residential development, which has been proposed and debated repeatedly in the context of Denver's westward expansion, the exposure pathway assumptions that underlie the regulatory standards would require revision. The contamination in the soil and groundwater would not change. The administrative framework for evaluating it would. There's a category of infrastructure that human societies build, lose administrative control over, and then re-encounter as a geological fact. Rocky Flats is in that category. The plan was operational for 37 years. The cleanup took 17 years. The required monitoring duration, calibrated to the half-life of the primary contaminant, is 24,100 years. The ratio of operational lifespan to required monitoring duration is approximately 1 to 650. For every year the plant manufactured nuclear weapon components, it created a monitoring obligation of 650 years. The total monitoring obligation generated by the Rocky Flats operational period is the equivalent of the time elapsed since before the construction of the Egyptian pyramids, multiplied by approximately 4. The institutional frameworks assigned to honor that obligation have demonstrated historical continuity measured in decades. The mathematics of this situation are not ambiguous. They are simply uncomfortable to state in the language of administrative planning, where the relevant time horizon is typically the next budget cycle. The wildlife refuge designation of the Rocky Flats buffer zone accomplishes several administrative functions simultaneously. It removes the land from the residential development pipeline, which would trigger the more stringent residential contamination standard. It provides a legally protected land use classification that limits future pressure for development. It enables the creation of a public-facing narrative about ecological restoration and prairie habitat recovery that is accurate as far as it extends. The tallgrass prairie vegetation is real. The nesting raptors are real. The recovering mammal populations are real. The contamination in the soil beneath the prairie is also real. These two facts are not in logical contradiction. They coexist in the same physical space, with the administrative record distributing emphasis between them according to the institutional requirements of the moment. The steel and concrete of Building 771 no longer exist above ground. The demolition was complete. The debris was characterized, classified, and disposed of in licensed facilities. The excavated soil from the most heavily contaminated areas was containerized and shipped to the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant in New Mexico, which is itself a deep geological repository built inside a salt formation and engineered for a regulatory compliance period of 10,000 years. The material that left Rocky Flats in those containers is now in a different geological holding matrix, monitored by a different set of institutional arrangements, subject to the same fundamental mathematical problem. The material's active period exceeds the demonstrated longevity of any institution humans have created to monitor it by a factor that makes the comparison structurally meaningless. What remains at Rocky Flats after the $7 billion cleanup is not clean. It is remediated to a specific numerical standard calibrated for a specific land use classification. The soil below the remediation depth, the material that was determined to be below the action level and therefore left in place, contains plutonium-239. The groundwater monitoring wells record the slow migration of the contamination inventory through the subsurface. The hikers on the surface trail are ambulatory over a geological holding tank, whose active period is measured in units of time that exceed the entire span of human civilization by a factor of approximately 5. The administrative record of this situation is comprehensive, detailed, and publicly available to anyone who requests it from the relevant federal repositories. The interpretive signs at the trailhead describe the raptors. The administrative record describes the rest. The Infinity Room no longer exists as a physical space. Building 771 was demolished. Room 141 was excavated to its foundation, and the material removed under specialized containment protocol. The Geiger counters that registered infinite readings in that room have been replaced by the administrative fiction of completed remediation. The designation survives as a notation in the cleanup documentation. It is an accurate physical description of what that space contained, a concentration of radioactive material so extreme that the instruments designed to measure it could not produce a finite number. The institutional response to that infinite reading was to spend $7 billion converting it into a finite number suitable for a regulatory compliance certificate. The half-life of the material that produced the infinite reading is 24,100 years. The regulatory compliance certificate is dated 2005. The arithmetic of the situation does not require elaboration. The numbers contain everything that needs to be said.